The city was a vast, bustling place, but underneath the hustle and bustle of everyday life, there was a quiet desperation that lingered in the air. Tall glass buildings rose above, reflecting the sunlight that never seemed to reach the cracked sidewalks below. The streets were filled with people walking quickly, their faces blank, their eyes glazed over. It was as if everyone had a place to be and no time to care for the ones around them. The harsh reality of life was everywhere, hidden behind the fancy shops and expensive cars. Among the sea of people, there was an elderly man, hunched over with age. His name was Rahim, and he had spent the last few years of his life as a beggar. He had nothing left to call his own, save for a small, ragged blanket he kept in the corner of the street where he sat every day. His clothes were torn, his shoes worn out, and his face weathered by the years of hard living. But there was something different about Rahim. Despite his poverty, there was a softness in his eyes, a kindness that seemed to rise above the suffering. Around him, Rahim didn't mind the cold that gnawed at his bones, or the hunger that often consumed him. He had learned to survive on the little he had, finding solace in the simplicity of his life. But it wasn't always this way. Once, Rahim had a family, a home, a life filled with hope and dreams, but those days were long gone. The city had swallowed everything he loved, and he had nothing left but memories of better times. Yet even in the darkest corners of his existence, Rahim remained hopeful. He believed in kindness, in the goodness of people, even though it had been years since anyone had shown him any. It was a typical day on the busy street, with the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the air. People rushed past, their faces set in expressions of indifference as they went about their day, avoiding the beggars and the homeless as though they were invisible. Among the crowd, Rahim sat quietly on the cold sidewalk, his hat outstretched. In front of him, hoping for a few coins. His hands were trembling, not just from the cold but from hunger. Yet he never lost the spark of humanity in his heart, never gave up on the possibility that someone might notice him and offer a small act of kindness. Just as Rahim was beginning to lose hope, a small figure caught his eye. A boy, no older than 10 or 11, was sitting on the opposite side of the street, his small body curled into itself for warmth. His clothes were ragged, barely covering his skin, and his face was drawn with hunger, eyes empty and distant. The child Adil seemed to blend into the background, unnoticed by the busy pedestrians who hurried past him. Rahim could see the desperation in the boy's eyes, a look he had once worn himself. His heart softened as he watched Adil, wondering how anyone could ignore such a tiny soul in need. Rahim hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with uncertainty. He barely had enough for himself, but the sight of Adil sitting alone, with nothing, into his name, struck a chord deep within him. Rahim's hand shook slightly as he reached into the small tin he kept for his own coins. His fingers brushed the few coins left, the last of his meager earnings for the day. The choice was a difficult one: keep the coins for himself or give them to a child who had nothing. But Rahim knew the answer before he even asked the question. Without a second thought, he gathered what little he had left and stood up, making his way toward Adil. As Rahim approached, the boy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. He had clearly not expected anyone to approach him, let alone offer him anything. Rahim knelt beside the boy, holding out the coins in his palm. Adil blinked a few times, as if unsure whether he had truly seen what he thought he had. "Here," Rahim said softly, his voice warm despite his own aching hunger. "Take this. You need it more than I do." Adil's eyes filled with tears, and his hands trembled as he accepted the coins. He looked at Rahim for a long moment, as if trying to understand why someone so poor would give away what little they had. "Thank you, sir," Adil whispered, his voice shaky but sincere. "Thank you so much." Rahim smiled faintly, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He patted the boy gently on the shoulder, feeling a connection that transcended words. "You're welcome," Rahim said, his voice almost a whisper. "May things get better for you." As he stood up to leave, he looked back at Adil, who was now clutching the coins tightly, his face filled with both relief and gratitude. Rahim turned and walked away, but his heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Even in his poverty, he had made a difference in someone's life. Rahim walked back to his usual spot, his heart strangely full despite the gnawing hunger in his stomach. The street felt a little less cold, the bustling noise of the city a little less harsh. As he sat down, the weight of his decision still lingered in his chest, but it was a weight he could bear. He had given his last coins to the child, but for some reason he felt no regret. It was as if the act of kindness had somehow filled the emptiness that had followed him for so long. There was a strange peace within him, a quiet joy that had nothing to do with his circumstances. As Rahim settled in, he couldn't help but look back at Adil, who was still sitting on the other side of the street. The boy hadn't moved much, his eyes fixed on the small pile of coins in his hands. Rahim watched as Adil carefully placed them into the pocket of his torn jacket, his fingers lingering on the fabric for a moment before he looked up again. The moment their eyes met, Adil's face broke into a smile, the first genuine smile Rahim had seen in a long time. It wasn't a smile filled with joy or celebration, but a smile of gratitude, pure and untainted. Adil slowly stood up and crossed the street toward Rahim, his footsteps hesitant at first, as though unsure whether it was okay to approach the old man. Rahim gave him a small nod, inviting him to come closer. The boy stopped a few feet away, his hand still clutching the coins in his pocket, his face full of appreciation. Rahim's heart warmed at the sight. "Thank you, sir," Adil said again, his voice quieter now but no less sincere. "I don't know what to say. You've helped me more than anyone else has." Rahim could see the sincerity in the boy's eyes. He felt as though Adil was carrying a weight far too heavy for his small frame, something that Rahim understood all too well. Rahim smiled softly, shaking his head. "No need to thank me, child. I saw you and, well, you reminded me of myself when I was younger. I couldn't just walk past you and do nothing." Adil nodded, his eyes searching Rahim's face as though trying to understand him. For a moment, there was silence between them, the noise of the city fading into the background. It was as though the world had momentarily stopped, and in that moment, it was just the two of them. "One day, sir," Adil said suddenly, his voice a little more confident, "I'll be able to help you, just like you helped me." Rahim looked at the boy in surprise. It wasn't a promise made lightly. It was a promise made with the same sincerity that had filled his own heart when he gave Adil the coins. Rahim's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a pang of something deeper than gratitude, a sense of connection, of hope. "You don't need to repay me, child," Rahim said, his voice soft but firm. "What matters is that you survive and you remember kindness. That's all." Adil looked up at him once more, his eyes shining with something that resembled both hope and determination. "I will, sir," Adil said quietly, then paused before adding, "I'll never forget you." Rahim nodded, the weight of the boy's words settling deep within him. As the boy turned and began to walk away, Rahim watched him disappear into the crowd. His heart felt lighter, the world suddenly brighter, despite everything he had lost. Rahim closed his eyes for a moment, his thoughts swirling with the promise of a better tomorrow, a future where kindness, no matter how small, could change lives. Sun had set, casting long shadows over the city streets. The once bustling area was now quiet, with only a few pedestrians lingering, hurrying to reach their homes. Rahim, however, had no home to go to. He made his way to the small, forgotten bridge where he spent most nights, lying under the faded, tattered blanket that had become his only companion. The cold wind cut through his thin coat, and he shivered as he settled down on the ground, trying to find comfort in the hard concrete beneath him. Despite the chill in the air, there was a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the physical world. The kindness he had shown earlier that day still lingered inside him, like a faint glow that refused to fade. As Rahim wrapped himself tighter in his blanket, he stared up at the dark sky. The city lights glittered in the distance, but they seemed far removed from him, as if he lived in a different world entirely. His mind wandered back to the brief moment he had shared with Adil, the child's face filled with gratitude. Rahim couldn't remember the last time he had felt that kind of connection. It had been so long since he'd been seen by anyone, really seen. He had spent years begging on these streets, asking for scraps, but no one had ever offered him the same kindness that he had extended to Adil. Rahim's thoughts drifted back to his own past, to the days when he had a family, a small home, and a future that seemed filled with possibilities. He could still remember the laughter of his children, the warmth of his wife's smile, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the kitchen. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago. The world had changed in ways he couldn't understand, and he had lost everything: his job, his home, his loved ones. Now he was nothing more than a ghost in the city, unnoticed and forgotten by the people who passed him by. The life he had once known seemed like a distant dream, unreachable and out of sight. Yet despite everything, Rahim still held onto a fragile thread of hope. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. As the night grew darker and the sounds of the city faded away, Rahim found himself wide awake. The cold seeped into his bones, but it was the loneliness that kept him from sleep. He thought of Adil again, wondering what had become of the boy. Had he found somewhere safe to sleep? Did he have food to eat? Rahim sighed and closed his eyes, hoping that somehow, somewhere, Adil was warm and cared for. But in the pit of his stomach, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was an unfair place, where some people were destined to suffer while others went on without a second thought. Rahim lay there for hours, lost in thought, his body aching, his mind restless. There were no answers to the questions he asked, no solace to be found in the darkness, but through it all, a small part of him remained hopeful. Adil had reminded him that there was still kindness in the world, still goodness among the shadows. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough to keep him going another day. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The city was still waking up, the streets quiet, except for the occasional footsteps of early risers. Rahim stirred beneath his tattered blanket, his body stiff from the cold, his stomach hollow with hunger. He sat up slowly, rubbing his tired eyes, preparing himself for yet another day of struggle. Nothing had changed. He was still a beggar, still homeless, still invisible to the world. But as he stretched his aching limbs, his fingers brushed against something unusual inside his coat pocket. His brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't remember placing anything there. With trembling hands, Rahim reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. His heart pounded as he examined it. The paper was slightly crumpled, and his name, Rahim, was scrawled on the front in uneven handwriting. He blinked, trying to make sense of it. Who had put this in his pocket? He had been alone all night, hadn't he? His fingers trembled as he carefully unfolded the letter, his breath hitching as he read the first few words. "You saved me today. Tomorrow, you will be saved." Rahim's hands tightened around the paper. The words were simple, yet they sent a strange shiver down his spine. He continued reading. "Rahim, I don't know if you believe in fate, but I do. Yesterday you gave me the last of what you had. No one else has ever done that for me. I don't have much to give you in return, but I promise, kindness always comes back. Keep this letter close. Soon, things will change for you." The letter wasn't signed, but Rahim didn't need a signature to know who it was from. Adil. The boy must have slipped it into his pocket while he wasn't looking. But how? When? Rahim was sure he had seen Adil walk away the previous day. His mind raced with questions. Was this a simple gesture of gratitude, or was there something more to it? The words on the page felt like a whisper of fate, a message meant to reach him at the right time. Rahim's fingers traced over the ink, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He had lived too long believing that life was nothing but suffering, that the world had long since forgotten him. And yet, here was proof that someone had seen him, someone had remembered. Even if it was just a child, it meant something. For the first time in years, he felt noticed, not as a beggar, not as a forgotten soul, but as a person worthy of kindness. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his pocket, holding it close as if it were a treasure. The world around him remained unchanged. The same cold pavement, the same indifferent city, but something inside him had shifted. Rahim didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, something good was coming his way. The city had fully awakened by the time Rahim stepped onto the streets, the usual chaos unfolding around him. Cars honked, vendors shouted, and people moved with purpose, lost in their own concerns. But today, Rahim felt different. He kept his hand inside his pocket, his fingers brushing over the letter from a deal. It was just a piece of paper, yet it held a strange power over him, a warmth that hadn't existed before. He didn't understand why, but for the first time in years, he felt like something was about to change. With slow, steady steps, Rahim walked toward his usual spot near the marketplace. The scent of fresh bread and spices filled the air, making his stomach churn painfully. He had nothing to eat since yesterday, but he was used to this feeling. As he sat down against the wall, he pulled his blanket around his shoulders and prepared for another long day of being ignored. But then something unexpected happened. A man, well-dressed and middle-aged, stopped in front of him. He had a sharp but kind face, with eyes that studied Rahim carefully. "Are you Rahim?" the man asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Rahim blinked in surprise. No one had asked for his name in years. "Yes," he answered hesitantly. The man's face softened. "I've been looking for you." Rahim frowned, confusion settling over him like a thick fog. Why would anyone be looking for him? "Who are you?" he asked cautiously. The man smiled. "My name is Mr. Ali. I heard about what you did for the boy yesterday." Rahim's breath caught in his throat. "A deal?" he whispered. Mr. Ali nodded. "Yes, he's special to me." Rahim's mind raced. Had he done something wrong? Was a deal in trouble? Mr. Ali seemed to sense his worry and quickly reassured him. "You don't need to be afraid. You did something most wouldn't. You gave him your last coins when you had nothing yourself." His eyes held a look of quiet admiration. "People like you are rare." Rahim shook his head. "I only did what was right." Mr. Ali studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "That's exactly why I want to help you." Rahim's heart pounded as the words sank in. Help? No one had ever offered him help before. "I have a small business," Mr. Ali continued. "I need someone trustworthy, someone who understands hardship, someone like you." He paused, giving Rahim time to process. "I can offer you work, a place to stay. It won't be much, but it will be better than this." He gestured to the cold pavement where Rahim sat. Rahim opened his mouth, but no words came out. It felt unreal. Could this truly be happening? His whole life he had been trapped in the cycle of poverty, believing there was no way out. And now, because of a small act of kindness, a door had opened. His hands trembled as he looked down at the letter in his pocket, the words echoing in his mind, "Tomorrow you will be saved." Taking a deep breath, Rahim looked up at Mr. Ali. For the first time in years, hope flickered in his heart like a dying ember being reignited. With a nod, he whispered, "I'll do it." And just like that, his life began to change. The next morning, Rahim woke up in a small but clean room, the scent of fresh air replacing the usual stench of the streets. For the first time in years, he had slept on a real bed, with a roof over his head. The warmth of the blanket around him was unfamiliar, but comforting. He sat up slowly, still adjusting to this sudden change in his life. It felt like a dream, one he feared might vanish if he let himself believe in it too much. But then his fingers brushed against his pocket, where the letter from Adil still remained, reminding him that this was real. As Rahim dressed, a thought entered his mind. Adil. He had to find him. The boy had changed his life, yet Rahim didn't even know where he had gone. He needed to thank him, to let him know that his words had come true. With that determination, Rahim stepped outside, the sun warming his face as he made his way back to the street where they had first met. The city was the same as always, people rushing past, ignoring those who had nothing. But Rahim was different. Now, he wasn't just another forgotten soul anymore. When he reached the place where Adil had been sitting, he expected to see the boy curled up in the same spot, waiting for another act of kindness. But the space was empty. Frowning, Rahim looked around, searching for any sign of the child. He approached a fruit vendor nearby. "Excuse me," Rahim said hesitantly. "There was a boy here yesterday, a small child about 10 years old. Have you seen him?" The vendor barely glanced at him. "Plenty of kids beg around here. Who knows where they go?" he said before turning back to his work. Rahim's heart sank. He asked a few more people, each response the same. No one had seen Adil. It was as if the boy had vanished overnight. Frustration built inside him. Had Adil moved to another part of the city? Was he safe? The thought of the boy wandering, alone in the cold, gnawed at Rahim's chest. He had to keep searching. He spent the entire day walking through the streets, asking anyone who would listen, but no one had any answers. It was as though Adil had never existed at all. The more he searched, the stranger it felt. The memory of their conversation, the letter Adil had left him, it was all real, and yet no one remembered the boy. Exhausted, Rahim sat on a bench, rubbing his temples. Had fate only meant for their paths to cross once? Just then, an old woman, sitting nearby, spoke up. "You're looking for the boy, aren't you?" Rahim's head snapped up. "Yes, you've seen him." The woman shook her head slowly. "No, but you're not the first to ask about him." Rahim frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "Many have spoken of a boy like him over the years. A child who appears in times of need, then disappears. Without a trace." Rahim's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, to say that wasn't possible, but deep down, something told him the woman wasn't lying. Adil had come into his life at the exact moment he needed him, leaving behind a message of hope and a promise of change. And now he was gone, like a whisper in the wind. Had Adil been more than just a hungry child? Was he sent to guide Rahim toward a new beginning? The thought sent chills down his spine. Rahim clutched the letter in his pocket, realizing that perhaps he would never truly know. Rahim sat on the bench long after the old woman had left, staring at the world moving around him. The weight of everything that had happened settled deep in his chest. He had spent so many years believing he was forgotten, that kindness no longer existed. But in just 2 days, everything had changed. Adil had appeared, given him hope, and then disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived. Was he just a lost child, or was there something more to his presence? Rahim didn't know, but one thing was certain. Adil had changed his life forever. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the letter once more, reading the words carefully. "You saved me today. Tomorrow you will be saved." The words carried a weight he hadn't fully understood before. At first, he thought Adil had written them as a simple thank you. But now, after all that had happened, Rahim wondered if they were something more, a prophecy, a promise that fate had kept. His heart swelled with gratitude. He may never see Adil again, but he would never forget him. Taking a deep breath, Rahim stood up. For the first time in years, he had somewhere to go, a place to work, a place to sleep, a new life waiting for him. He had spent so long believing the streets were all he would ever know, but now he had a second chance, and it had all started with a small act of kindness, a few coins given to a hungry child. He had thought he was saving Adil that day, but in truth, Adil had saved him. As Rahim walked toward his new future, he glanced up at the sky. The city was the same, filled with noise and indifference, but it no longer felt so cruel. Somewhere in the crowd, there were others like Adil, like himself, people who just needed someone to notice them, to offer them a chance. Rahim vowed that one day when he had enough, he would do for someone else what Adil had done for him. He would repay the kindness that had been given to him, passing it forward, just as fate had intended. With his hands in his pockets and his heart lighter than it had been in years, Rahim smiled to himself. Maybe Adil was just a boy, or maybe he was something more, an angel, a guardian, a lesson sent by the universe. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Rahim believed again. He believed in kindness, in hope, in the idea that life could still change for the better. And as he stepped into his new future, he knew one thing for certain: he would never be the same again.